Hello everyone and welcome once again to ThursDev. I'm your host Luke, and today I wanted to give you lovely folks out there a brief history lesson that I think is fairly relevant to the current video game development landscape. With the recent switch by Steam from crowdsourcing product greenlighting to an open market system in the same manner as the App Store, Google Play, and a few other digital marketplaces, we've seen the barriers to entry into game self-publishing and distribution torn further and further down from the walled garden that it once was. Only a decade ago, in order to make a video game, you'd be beholden to major platform holders like Nintendo, Sony, and Microsoft until somewhat recently, and though PC has been an open platform for the most part, in order to get your product onto one of the more popular distribution platforms like Steam, it would still go through a rigorous vetting system. This wasn't always the case, however. Game developers skew young, but I was astounded when one of my own co-workers was too young to have known what I was talking about when I referred in a conversation to the video game console crash of 1983. So, for all of you too young to remember, or who maybe have heard about it but didn't really know what it's all about, allow me to bend your ear for a few minutes. Let me tell you about the old Atari, and how it almost destroyed video gaming as we know it. This is a story that many have told, so you may already know it, but considering that Atari, though only Atari in name anymore and really having nothing to do with the Atari of today's story, is planning on releasing their own new console, it's a funny, surprisingly cyclical story. Back in the 1970s and early 80s, video games were still an infant industry. It was something of a Wild West, where no genres had been established, there was no convention to fall back on in design, and the limitations of the hardware available meant that a lot of innovation was necessary to do anything even remotely interesting. Though the arcade ruled in the 70s, there were a few shots taken by some enterprising hardware companies to take the arcade experience and bring it to the consumer's home. Magnavox broke ground in 1972 with their Odyssey, and soon after, Coleco released the Telstar, but despite the Odyssey being an objective hit at 350,000 units sold worldwide, it wasn't until the second and almost last generation of video game consoles that they really took off. After the runaway success of the arcade hit Pong, and a successful run of standalone home versions of the same, with the help of a distribution agreement with store chain Sears, Atari, headed by Nolan Bushnell, decided to make the shift from standalone Pong machines to the development of a device that they were calling the VCS, or Video Computer System. Its original concept, apparently, was to create a home system that would be able to play all of Atari's 4 massive arcade hits interchangeably at home, using cartridges. The machine would be a direct competitor to the Magnavox Odyssey 2 and was, for its time, bleeding-edge technology. The video game market was still a relative question mark in the grand scheme of things, but there were a few entertainment businesses that were completely on the ball. And serendipitously, around the same time that Bushnell had made a decision to attempt to raise capital for Atari by selling ownership to a larger investor, Steve Ross, CEO of Warner at the time, apparently had gained a significant interest in the digital gaming business after seeing his own children's reactions to playing the 8-player maze game Tank 8 at Disney World, which just so happened to be published by Atari. So when Bushnell approached Warner to propose a buyout, they entered into a 6-month acquisition process and made an arrangement to purchase Atari for $28 million. A deal that, after the release of the VCS under its new name, the Atari 2600, would skyrocket Atari to the legendary status that it once held. Together, they built one of the most successful and fastest growing companies in American history over the next few years, raising capital by an order of magnitude into the billions of dollars in annual sales by 1982. The ouster of Bushnell, a serial entrepreneur and party animal in 1978 by Warner, and subsequent installation of Ray Kassar, a stiff-collared ex-textile industry businessman, none too affectionately referred to by his employees as the Towel Czar, however, created something of a rift between corporate Warner and the hippie culture of the former Atari. Kassar's Atari treated games as any other product, not a work of individuals, but as the company's property, and as such, there was no thought given to giving credit to or rewarding the creators of video games for their work. This rubbed more than a few of the developers the wrong way. And when 4 disgruntled Atari employees splintered off to form a little studio that they called Activision and made their own games, the first instance of third-party software was born. While Atari themselves continued to grind out software for their own system, demand and a lack of even the concept of hardware DRM to prevent third-party software from running on their system allowed companies aside from Atari to release games on the system. And release they did. Atari saw this upstart making money hand over fist and, in their minds, stealing potential profits. They and Activision butted heads, and the feud resulted in a years-long legal battle between Atari and other third-party developers that would follow suit, and eventually ended in Atari conceding that, though they couldn't prevent third parties from creating their own products, even if they were meant to run on Atari's video game system, they would receive royalties from the sale of software that required their hardware. This was a victory from the games industry in general and helped to create the system of third-party development we know today, but it also came at a cost. Remember that little lack of hardware DRM that I mentioned? Well, people saw the money that Activision was making and the apparent general thought was, hey, I can probably do that. And game companies began popping up all over. With no oversight, anyone who had the ability to program, and many who didn't, were given carte blanche to make games for the Atari 2600. This resulted in an explosion in third-party titles, starting with a modest 13 third-party titles in 1981, then an almost tenfold increase in 1982 to over 120, and then over 170 more in 1983. There was a glut of software, and the vast majority of it was, objectively, garbage. While some of these were high-quality games like Pitfall, Frogger, and Zaxxon, the absolute impossibility to control the games on the 2600's platform meant that there were messes like Mythicon's Firefly, awful ports like the debacle that was Pac-Man, and the first graphical porn games like the infamous Custer's Revenge. An inability by the consumer to separate the wheat from the chaff in what games were and weren't worth buying had a near-apocalyptic effect, and Atari was in danger of losing its consumer base completely. Then, in 1982, enter Steven Spielberg and the summer blockbuster E.T. the Extraterrestrial. The movie was so massive that the concept of a game based on it was a no-brainer. Warner immediately went into negotiation with Spielberg and by late June had negotiated worldwide exclusive rights to create a game based on the film. They put ink to paper to the tune of somewhere between 20 and 25 million 80s bucks, and come the end of July, they were ready to start production. Except they needed that game for the Christmas season. That meant a September 1st deadline for development. They had August to make a mind-blowing game based on a mind-blowing film which would have made mind-blowing profits. But it wasn't, and they didn't. You might have heard of Atari ET. My brother and I had a copy when we were children, and it was, well, awful. It was about exactly what you'd expect from a game created by one man with only 1 month from concept to release, without modern tools to create it with, and who, in a moment of hubris, decided he wanted to spend that time doing something avant-garde and sentimental instead of the Pac-Man-style maze game that Spielberg said he wanted. But nobody knew that yet. The hype machine was in full force, and the New York Times even predicted that licensed games based on movies, especially E.T., would become an increasingly profitable source for video game development going into the future. The predicted demand was so great, somewhere between 4 and 5 million copies were made of the game, exceeding even the number of Atari 2600 consoles that were on the market at all, in anticipation of building and selling more. It was going to be their salvation. They had released so many garbage games on their console that it was almost non-salvageable at that point, and E.T. was their undoing. Consumer faith in the Atari was already waning, and then this? The honeymoon was over, and the gaming public wanted a divorce. Remember in my video about your players not caring about you, and how you have to release good products to keep interest? Imagine that on an industry-wide scale. The games industry imploded. Stores stopped stocking them on shelves, and investors who were once gung-ho about the games industry now found that games were poison to profitability. Home video game consoles were dead. Video gaming itself might have been close to dead were it not for a few hangers-on in the PC space, like Sierra Online. Nobody cared about consoles anymore, and nobody wanted to touch them with a 10-foot pole, and that lasted for a few years. If it wasn't for a Japanese card company called Nintendo having the ingenious idea of bringing their brand new Famicom video game console to the West and marketing it as a piece of consumer electronics with strict quality control, that they may have fallen apart in the West altogether in the 1980s. It was their stricter business practices and the open courting of the third parties to make quality content for their console that helped set a standard for gaming in the West and ultimately revitalized the industry into the multi-billion-dollar business that it is today. But the moral of this story, as it were, is that Atari, powerhouse that it was unraveled by an overabundance of games and a lack of quality control. Too many garbage games on your platform, and people are going to start avoiding your platform to find something better. By no means is this a perfect analog for today's distribution platforms. Better business models and at least nominal quality control measures are in place, but it still ought to be kept in the heart as a cautionary tale about too much freedom in an open marketplace. You think that all of the asset rehash games that came out last year were bad. But that's it for me today. I'd like to thank you very much for joining me here today with this little trip down early video game history's memory lane, and I hope that you found it entertaining and educational, or at least one of those. If you'd like to see more like this, there are over 70 video game development related videos in the ThursDev series, and much more to discover here at Level Zero NPCs, so do consider subscribing and becoming a member of this little community of game enthusiasts who love both the making and the playing of video games. Thank you once again for dropping by, and I do hope sincerely that I'll see you here again soon. Take care.